our presenter today at Google Talks, Annalee Newitz, who is the founding editor of the website io9.com. Actually, I am from Venezuela. I sit in Venezuela. I have friends in Korea that sit in Venezuela. And she just published this fantastic book that came out last week in paperback. And it is about scatter, adapt, and remember. And she's going to take us through a travel, a visit through the universe and through time, and to tell us how we will survive. So with that, I think, Annalee, we are going to enjoy this so much. So a big applause to Annalee, please.
Thanks very much. So I'm a science journalist, which means that what I do when I write is look at science and culture in context. That's usually how I explain it to people who wonder what that is. And sometimes that context can be quite small, like it might be the context of a laboratory where people have made a discovery and what it was like to do that and how that discovery happened and how they got funding. And sometimes the context is really big, like deep time, or what happened on Earth over the past 3.5 billion years since life evolved. And my most recent book project, as Jose mentioned, is about this much larger context. And I have to admit that my inspiration for writing this book was not actually a sense of being moved by the vastness of space and time, but my interest in disaster movies, and specifically Godzilla movies. So you probably all know that I'm pretty excited right now because there's a new Godzilla movie coming out. And I was interested in the idea of, as a science journalist, what would be the real-life equivalent of a disaster movie, like a horrific disaster movie? Not one of these small-scale ones where like a building burns down or like a town is flooded, but something where the entire planet is being eaten by giant monsters. What would be the real-life scientific equivalent of that? And it turns out to be these events that we call mass extinctions. And there have been 5 of these events already since life evolved on Earth, since multicellular life evolved, I should say. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today, is what these events are, how life made it through them, and what the future of humanity is as we face what really may be a new mass extinction. And we can talk about that maybe in Q&A, the evidence for and against the next mass extinction. Basically, a mass extinction is any time when 75% or more of all species on the planet die out over a period of about 1 million or 2 million years, which those numbers are huge, but 1 million years in geological time is actually quite short. I have a little illustration for you that I like of geological time here. And what you can see from this drawing is that actually when geologists look back at history, and oftentimes they actually will be looking at a cliff face where they can see layers in the rock, often the boundaries between geological periods are marked by mass extinctions, because these are times when, because of that 75% number, you have to think about that, 75% or more of all species die out, basically means that an entire set of ecosystems die and a new set rise up to replace them. And so when you're looking in the fossil record, it's easy to see those events because suddenly you see, for example, no more trilobites, or no more of a particular kind of animal, no more megafauna, giant dinosaurs and such. So these mass extinctions of this magnitude, there's only been 5 so far in the history of the planet. And the more I was researching, the more it became clear that there were commonalities between these different mass extinction events. And I should say, there have been plenty of other extinction events, by the way, where only like, say, 30 or 40% of all species on the planet die out, which is already a huge catastrophe. If that happened to us now, we would all be starving and probably dealing with plagues. So none of those are fun, but the mass extinctions, these are the ones where you see this huge spike where it's just literally almost all life expires. And what's in common between these big events, these big mass extinctions, is usually they're precipitated by some kind of terrible event. The most recent mass extinction that you've probably all heard about is the one that destroyed most of the dinosaurs 65 million years ago when an asteroid smashed into the planet. and there were also megavolcanoes going off in India. There's some debate over what happened next after the asteroid hit the planet, but what we do know is that ultimately, over time, first there was, explosions and fire and things like that, but over time what happened was that that event set off a climate change, climate changes across the planet, and that was really what killed off most of the animals. And we see this happening again and again. In all 5 of these previous mass extinctions, what's happened is some horrific event, maybe megavolcanoes, I'll talk a bit about that in a second, maybe cosmic radiation, but ultimately the long-term death, that 1 million years of horrible everybody dying, is caused by habitat changes and by climate changes. So you can already see why, for example, now scientists are a little bit concerned that we may be entering into a new phase of mass extinction because we're entering a phase of extreme, what a geologist would call perturbations in the carbon cycle, which is to say climate changes caused by carbon loading in the atmosphere. And these are, these events can be associated, as they are today, with extinctions. So before I talk to you about my favorite mass extinction, because I have one, everyone who studies this stuff does, I want to tell you a little bit more about those perturbations in the carbon cycle. I want to talk about Snowball Earth. How many people know what Snowball Earth is? Okay, a few of you have studied your ancient Earth history. So basically, it's interesting to think about this time period, which happened shortly after the evolution of life on the planet, because it's a good example of how life forms have been changing the environment on the planet since life evolved. So humans love to think about themselves in general, but one of the things that we love to think about ourselves is that we're the only animals that ever came along and changed the habitat on the planet to the point where we are causing climate changes. Well, it turns out that about 2 billion years ago, there was another life form on the planet that was changing the environment much more than we ever did. And that life form is known as cyanobacteria. And there's in fact cyanobacteria now too, distant descendants of this early life form. It's also known as blue-green algae, your friend, blue-green algae. So here's what was awesome about cyanobacteria. At the time that they evolved, which was about 3.5 billion years ago, they're really early life forms, they had an innovation that no other life form had, which was that they could live in water and use a photon to split a water molecule to get energy out of it. And the only byproduct of this was oxygen. Well, the thing was, at that time, the atmosphere on the planet was mostly methane-based. So all of the archaea and all of the other life forms living around didn't use oxygen in their respiration cycles. So they're all hanging out saying, I love my clean methane-based environment. Everything is great because there's no terrible pollution from oxygen, for example. But then these guys come along and they've got this great innovation, photosynthesis, and they can spread anywhere, live anywhere there's light and water, and the planet is mostly covered in water at this point, they can live there. And so they just start farting out tons of oxygen, tons and tons and tons of oxygen, to the point where they are poisoning the planet. Literally all of the life forms that were around at that time either perished or actually went to become quite similar to the organisms that now live in volcanic vents at the bottom of the ocean. So those may be distant relatives of these early creatures destroyed by oxygen. And no one would ever consider this Snowball Earth event, which I'll tell you about in a second, to be a mass extinction because it took a really long time. So it was on the order of 1 billion years as opposed to 1 million years. But what happened catastrophically was that as oxygen levels were raised in the atmosphere, the planet started to cool down. And this was at a time when the sun itself was actually cooler. It was actually that long ago that the sun was not sending out as much heat. And so more oxygen in the environment means cooler, just like more carbon in the environment means warmer. And eventually, you started to get these ice caps on the planet. And the more ice caps you had, the more light was reflected, which meant the ice caps would grow and grow and grow until basically many geologists now believe that that's kind of what we had for a while. Basically, the entire planet was covered in ice, which, how did the cyanobacteria survive is a big question. People often talk about, well, there was maybe like a little ring of goo around the equator where the cyanobacteria kind of hung out and kept polluting everything. And basically, the Snowball Earth cycle ended because of volcanism. Lots of volcanoes were going off, loading the environment with carbon, warming things up, and eventually returning the carbon cycle to a more even keel. But that's how the carbon cycle works, is it's always vacillating between these ice houses and these greenhouses. We couldn't probably have a Snowball Earth at this point because the sun is a bit warmer, and it's unlikely we would have such an intense runaway ice house effect. But certainly at that time, it's believed that possibly there were 3 of these events. So humans are not the only ones who pollute the environment with our gases. We're just the most recent and the most famous to ourselves. So let me tell you about the very best mass extinction ever. Oh, let's not go there yet. So when a mass extinction happens, as I mentioned, it's not like Snowball Earth where it takes a really long time and there's these kind of long periods where changes are taking place. They're taking place quickly. And the worst mass extinction that ever happened was 250 million years ago at the end of the Permian period. This is before dinosaurs evolved, so you can't imagine like giant monsters lumbering around on the planet. It was a period when there was a lot of life in the oceans. There were some animals on land and plants. And the Earth actually had one supercontinent called Pangaea. So all the continents were kind of pushed together. And it was a continent that stretched from the North Pole down to the South Pole. So it was a long kind of, not really narrow, but it was a long kind of a vertical continent, as opposed to earlier versions of Pangaea, which were kind of all at the bottom of the planet. That was a bad time when that happened. So at that time, so we have this nice big continent. Everything's going along great. Life has been evolving and diversifying. There's lots of plants. And suddenly, or perhaps not so suddenly, a megavolcano starts going off in what is now Siberia. And it's not a big explosive volcano. It's the kind of volcano where a crack opens in the earth and lots of lava oozes out. And along with that lava, you get a lot of toxic gases, a lot of greenhouse gases, and that's going on for about 1,000 years. So we have a volcano that is emitting gas and lava into the environment for 1,000 years, roughly. Scientists aren't sure if it kind of started and stopped, or if it just kept gushing. But it released so much lava that actually if you do visit Siberia today, you can go see the area. It's just called the Siberian Traps, quite beautiful now, which is all volcanic rock. But at the time, it's estimated that probably the amount of lava would have covered northern Europe. So it was a huge amount. But as I mentioned earlier, of course, the death toll from this event was not from like flaming waves of death, because lava is actually moving pretty slowly. So it's not like you couldn't kind of do the outrunning, the kind of action movie like, I'm running away from the wall of lava. You actually could have done that. And animals did run down from out of the north. But the problem was all of the carbon loading in the environment. So you get a lot of the same, at that time, we now see traces in the rocks of that era of the same exact kinds of problems that we're dealing with today. There was incredible ocean acidification. There were anoxic dead places in the ocean where there was so little oxygen that animals just couldn't survive there. Corals died off. In fact, they're beautiful coral reefs that just were gone. It was very, very difficult for life to continue in the ocean. And of course, on land, there was almost total devastation. In fact, it's estimated that 95% of all species died off during this period after the volcano had been erupting. And it was because of climate change. It was because you had this incredible greenhouse situation. One of the scientists who I talked to about this said, what came after this period, he likes to call slime world, because basically it was a great time to be slime, because there were a lot of dead bodies to eat. And slime adapt really well to acidic environments in the water and environments on land where the situation is is sort of terrible. So one of the only remaining survivors on land of this event was a four-legged animal here called Lystrosaurus. Lystrosaurus kind of became my mascot while I was writing this book, partly because it looks a little bit like a pig and a lizard, which is always great. This animal is called a synapsid. They're often called mammal-like reptiles because they were reptiles that over time began to evolve more and more mammal-like features, and eventually the ones that didn't go extinct evolved into mammals. So this is kind of our evolutionary uncle here. It's because of these creatures that we're here today and because of their hardiness in the face of this disaster. There's a lot of theories among geologists about why they survived because of the fact that after this horrific mass extinction, they were pretty much the only land animal. There were animals that were aquatic, there were animals that were kind of alligator-like, but these guys somehow managed to not just survive, but speciate, meaning they evolved into many different species over millions of years. They migrated down from the northern parts of the continent to the southern part of the continent, so that when the megacontinent broke up into two continents, there were already just tons of Lystrosaurus and its offspring in the southern continent. And they were just incredibly adaptable. They were burrowers, which meant, in fact, we found some amazing skeletons of them recently inside their burrows. So they may have been adapted to environments that already had a lot of dirt and gunk in the air. That's possibly one reason they survived. It may have just been that they were lucky. There may have been no predators that survived that ate them, because basically they were kind of the cows of the era. They would have been a really nice, tasty treat. I talked to an environmental scientist who said, yeah, they're just like cows. Yeah, I don't know. They weren't very big. They were sort of dog-sized. So I don't know how tasty they would be, but the point is nobody was really eating them. So the point is that if these creatures could survive, it gives us a good way of understanding how other animals make it through these kinds of catastrophic events. And that's what brings me to humanity. One of the things that I saw again and again in looking at animals that survived mass extinctions was that they had a lot of things in common with Lystrosaurus, for example, which is they could adapt to many environments. They could eat almost anything. And they were able to spread out away from danger. And one of the things that people have, of course, as animals, like just thinking about people as animals and not getting worried about things like science and wearing awesome dresses like the people in this picture are, as animals, we're an invasive species. We're terrific at going into new areas and adapting to them. We are terrific at scattering in the face of danger to get into better circumstances. And as I am fond of pointing out, we can eat garbage, and it seems to be just fine. And as you perhaps seen in your life. So we have the baseline characteristics of a species that can survive one of these disastrous events that last for these long periods of time. The thing that we have that, as far as we know, Lystrosaurus did not have, and many other survivors of mass extinctions like birds did not have, is that we have an ability to record our history. We have science and technology which use the scientific method to explore problems and come up with solutions to them. So we are actually able to figure out that we might be headed into a mass extinction, which I'm highly doubtful that Lystrosaurus did. And because we can know that, because we actually discovered things like carbon cycles 50 years ago or so, we're able to make plans for the future. And that was what I really became interested in, and that's what a large part of my book is about, is how we can learn from what's gone on before on the planet, from these disasters and these extinctions, and what we can do to plan for the future. So the question is, if you're looking to the future with survival in mind, if you are taking the warnings that we're getting about climate change and animal extinction seriously, what are the steps that we can take as a civilization to prepare ourselves to survive? So one of the first things that I think we have to consider is the fact that human beings right now are starting to live mostly in cities. So I wanted to look at a near-term future scenario for how humans might start surviving. And when I say near-term, I really mean the next 100 to 200 or 300 years. So it's not particularly near-term, like it's not next year. But in the rather near future, humans are already living in cities. More than half of humans are already living in cities. And over the next 100 years, it's likely that those numbers are really going to jump. We may be up to something like 75% of people living in cities by the end of this century. So how do we change our cities to be robust against disaster? So first of all, as I've mentioned, one of the big problems with mass extinction is climate change. So how do we start making cities that are more sustainable? How do we start building so that they can survive things like floods, which are inevitable with climate change, earthquakes, which are inevitable because we're in California, and other kinds of disasters which might be even more outlandish, like rocks from space or radiation from space. So one of the things that we need to think about is, and I have this building with biology injunction here, because one of the ways that these kinds of disasters take place, these mass extinctions, is not particularly exciting. We think of, megavolcanoes actually are kind of exciting. Asteroids from space, pretty good on the exciting scale. But generally, when you start having these climate changes, the reason why animals die out is because of famine and starvation. It's really simple. When you start having habitats change, food sources become less and less available. So herbivores that eat plants, if the climate changes, those plants are no longer available. If those herbivores die out, the carnivores that eat them also die out. So you get this kind of knock-on effect where the food webs, which are the webs of who eats whom, start to unravel. So if we're going to focus on how humans can live in the future to survive that kind of disaster, A, we have to focus on places where we're living, and B, we have to focus on how we can use those places to maintain our food security and to maintain sustainability so that we're not trashing the places where we're actually building our food. So this means partly rethinking our technology to incorporate things like biomimicry and biology. And that can be as simple as turning to alternative sources of fuel, solar fuels, biofuels, anything that's carbon neutral or carbon negative. But more futuristically, we could be starting to think about how cities can function like environmental systems. And this is something that very few people realize is going on in environmental science right now, but there's a huge push to just gather shitloads of data on how environmental systems work. To literally go into an environment or a habitat, count how many animals are there, count the kinds of things they're eating, trying to figure out all of the inputs that go into an environmental system and all of the outputs that result. And the inputs are strange and surprising. For example, there's a team in Canada at University of British Columbia that's been studying the composition of the microbiome in forests that are being farmed. They're just looking to see if farming forests over time is changing the kinds of bacteria that are available to the trees in the soil. And bacteria, of course, are very important for trees because they help with all kinds of things like nitrogen uptake and other processes. So what they found is that, yes, farming in forests actually cuts down on the diversity of the microbes that you have available in the soil. And that's, again, a very data-intensive process. It's just going out. I was talking to their field scientists, and they're like, yep, we just go into forests and collect chunks of soil and sequence it to find out what genetic material is in there. So there's a huge data gathering effort right now. And over time, people are going to be using programs to crunch that data, to simulate environments, to think about how do you, for example, put inputs into an environment or a habitat that change the way it behaves. Maybe you can change the way crops can survive in different kinds of climates. Maybe you can change the way crops produce sugar so that you can take more energy from them. There's all kinds of ways that we can intervene in environments in a sustainable way to also make them fit in with how humans are living in cities. The other thing that we need to be thinking about as we head into the future is actually not just making cities that kind of function like a metabolism or that interact with their environment better once we understand how environments function, but actually building our city environments using biological materials. So one of my favorite examples of what I'm talking about are self-healing materials. You've probably heard of self-healing materials. There's a lot of self-healing polymers that are used right now as ship sealants, for example. When they're exposed to heat, the cracks will close up. Here what I have is a couple pictures from a science project that a group of undergraduates did for the iGEM competition, which is an annual synthetic biology competition. And what they created was self-healing concrete, which is made with bacteria. It's modified bacteria, and they referred to it as bacillophila, which, if you're a biogeek, is a really hilarious joke. And they were using bacteria that basically had been modified to extrude epoxies when in contact with cement. So as you can see here, we can see a crack that had been made in some cement. This is obviously magnified. They smeared a bunch of bacteria on it, and over time, that bacteria grew to fill in the crack, and it extruded these epoxies, which actually made that concrete stronger in the end. And I should add, by the way, that when people do these kinds of synthetic biology projects where they're trying to create biological materials, one of the important things is building a kill switch into the bacteria, so you're not going to get like runaway cement tumors forming on your head and things like that, although that is obviously a danger because things can go wrong. So it's important that this is regulated. But what they've done here is show us a glimpse of what cities might be like in a future where we start building with modified biological materials that are in fact still alive. So not building with dead trees, but building with living materials that could in fact heal themselves, which is very sustainable, and in fact in a city like San Francisco where I live would be fantastic because we're constantly in danger of quakes, weakening infrastructure because of cracks and things like that. And so you can imagine in the future, I talked to this architect in New York who works a lot with synthetic biologists, who said his vision for a city in the future is basically something that looks like a ruin, that would be kind of covered in scars that had formed from self-healing buildings, covered in vines that have been modified to do things like purify water, or covered in vats that are bubbling up cyanobacteria that have been modified to produce fuels, because one of the outputs of cyanobacteria can be hydrogen fuel or other fuels, depending on how you modify it. And it would be this city that was partly alive and partly made of standard city materials, but it would look like this sort of ruin covered in plants, covered in scabs, but it would be this living, vital city that was almost indistinguishable from the nature around it. So it would be kind of like visiting an ancient city of the Maya, stumbling across it in the forest, in the jungle, and yet it would be a living, almost like a living organism. And the idea behind that, of course, again, is always about trying to make human habitation on the planet as close as possible to the already existing ecosystems so that we halt this process, this mass extinction process that's caused by climate changes. Of course, the fact is that even if we manage to completely change the way our cities behave, geoengineer the planet, fix the environment, live in like beautiful cities that look like trees and become elves or whatever else we're going to do, there's still a basic problem. I mentioned to you earlier that these previous mass extinctions, one was caused by megavolcanoes, another was caused by a giant ball from space smashing into Mexico, and these aren't problems that are going to go away. We actually live on a tectonically active planet. Volcanoes could come back at any point, really big megavolcanoes. By the way, Yellowstone is not one of those. You can ask me about that later. People always ask me about Yellowstone. That's not as dangerous as some of the other megavolcanoes that we're looking at. That would just screw things up for a couple years as opposed to like a millennium. So what do we do about that? And the question is really aimed at a far future look at where humanity would go to survive. We can't, if we expect to survive as a species, we can't continue to stay here. We have to eventually think about taking our species off the planet and into space habitats or other worlds, because, put it this way, if the whole planet is smashed by an asteroid, we'd like to have a backup civilization somewhere else so that humans can continue on. So the question is, first of all, what is the time scale on which this might happen? People often think, well, why don't we just go to space tomorrow? I mean, there's a Mars mission planned. We're all going to go move to Mars in a few, in like a decade, right? I think that we have to think of our move towards space as being something that is a much longer scale plan, a very long-term plan. And I think a good thought experiment for that is to recall that the first time that humans crossed an ocean to colonize a new continent was about 50,000 years ago, when humans left Asia and took boats very much like this one, these reed boats, down to Australia, and many thousands of years later to the Americas as well. And they were able to do that. They were able to take their reed boats, get to a new continent, and inhabit it. But it wasn't until about 500 years ago that boats were able to completely transform human culture and create global trade and the global culture that we think of as being human culture today. So there was a really big lag time between first successful deployment of boats for a cross-ocean voyage and global culture created around a whole shipping trade and a whole shipping system. So I don't think it's going to take 50,000 years this time. I think we probably can accelerate the process a little bit, but I think that it may take longer than we think, and that there's going to be a lot longer that we're going to have to spend here on Earth analyzing things like ecosystems and environments and changing the way that we live on the Earth before we can go to space, not the least of which because we're going to need to invent alternative fuels if we want to go to space, because I hate to break it to you, but rocket fuel kind of last centuries technology. We're going to need something more sustainable than that. We're going to need something that works a lot better than that. And also when we go to space, we're going to need ecosystems. We still eat things. We still need bacteria in our guts to be healthy. So we're going to need to bring all these environments from Earth with us into space, probably in a very modified version. But let's just talk about space for a second. If we're going to actually have a sustainable space culture, equivalent to that culture I was talking about where we had those shipping lanes where boats could cross the ocean all the time and bring you awesome crap from other countries, we're going to need something like a space elevator. This is just one of many kinds of big engineering projects that have been suggested as alternatives to using rockets to get people and things out of the gravity well of the planet. Because the biggest expense in terms of energy and money is always, how do you get the heck out of the gravity well and into space? And what we need is a renewable way of doing that. So in the 90s, some researchers at NASA actually took an idea that had been kind of tossed around among futurists and science fiction authors for a while to build, to actually talk about what would a space elevator really be like. And the idea is just that you have it's it's a bit futuristic, but the idea is that you float a counterweight on a tether that's attached to the planet, and it's about 60,000 miles up, and it's attached at the equator, and it's basically in geostationary orbit around the planet. And this tether that's anchoring your counterweight to the planet is the big question mark, right? We understand how a counterweight works. Maybe we'd capture an asteroid to do it or something like that, because this is the far future. But what would actually be this lightweight, amazing material that would link the Earth with this counterweight? We don't know yet. There's a lot of theories. But the idea is that you would have some kind of robotic device that would climb up that tether. It's referred to generally as a tether in the space elevator community. They have an annual meeting every year where they talk about possibilities for how you would build this tether. The robots, by the way, we've got, as you know. You can easily build a robot that can climb up a rope, especially if your rope is mostly in a zero gravity situation. It's very easy to pull up an elevator car that might, say, be quite large. Here you can see in this, this NASA artist's conception, you'd have a pretty darn big elevator car. You know, you might, and it would take you probably 3 days to get up that tether into space. So, you know, it's like a sleeper car. And people are going up, and also, again, materials are going up, right? This is a way of pulling materials out of the gravity well so that you can start actually constructing things in space. Because, again, that's going to save you a lot of energy. It's going to save you a lot of money. And so if you actually had a working space elevator and you had a tether made of carbon nanotubes or whatever we end up building it out of, you could be pulling people up out of the gravity well 3 times a day. So you could actually have a sustainable, repeatable way of getting people and objects into space. And that would really be the gateway to a true space-going civilization. But we don't really know what that would be like in the end, you know, going into space. Humans, in order to live in space, would have to probably be modified in some way. We'd have to be genetically modified in the same way we might genetically modify our plants to be more sustainable. For example, we would need to resist radiation damage. If we were going to go live on another world, we might need to be able to breathe in other kinds of atmospheres. And that's a huge leap to think about. When I was researching my book, I kept interviewing synthetic biologists and asking them, so when are we going to start modifying humans so we can live in space? You know, even though people are kind of studying this, I could not get a single biologist to go on record saying we would ever modify humans ever. Simply no, which is probably a good sign. But I wound up asking the science fiction writer Kim Stanley Robinson, who wrote the Red Mars series, which is fantastic if you haven't read it. And I said, okay, so all of his novels include this idea that humans will be genetically modifying themselves out the wazoo all the time in order to live in space. And I said, well, okay, none of these scientists will admit that they would ever want to do this. So how are we going to do that? Like, what's your idea as a science fiction writer? Like, how are we going to make that leap from here, where we will never modify the germline because it's our precious bodily germline, to modifying ourselves like crazy? And he said, it's going to be longevity. As soon as we have a way to modify our genome to live longer, that'll open the gateway, and people will start to be willing to think about other ways of modifying their genomes and other ways of changing the species. So that was his theory. As a science fiction writer, scientists have no theories yet because they're not going to do it. So somewhere in between those two possibilities, I think, lies our future as a species. And I want to conclude by saying that what we've seen from previous mass extinctions and previous transformations in the history of the planet is that ultimately the one thing that's held in common between all these life forms that survive is that they evolve. And so the question is, will humans evolve because we intervene in the process of evolution, change our genomes so that we can be more compatible with environments in space, change our genomes so that we're more compatible with environments on Earth? Will we change the genomes of many of the plants and animals around us to make them function better with human needs, transforming plants to be better biofuels, transforming animals to be, I don't know, working companions that are more functional? We just don't know what will happen, but we know that there will be these changes. And when we look back, of course, to our ancestors like Homo erectus, you know, it's obvious that these changes have taken place before, and there's no reason to think that they won't again. And we do have, as I said, as animals, we have these basic survivor traits. We are going to make it through. The question is just, will we make it through in a horrible state of famine and poverty, Or will we take measures now to start planning for disasters, planning for mass extinctions, and building a better civilization that is a survivable civilization so that we can live in style and maybe one day go to space? So that's the decision that we have to make now. And the good news is we'll survive, but also the bad news is even if we make wretched decisions, we'll probably also survive too. So there could be a very dark survival scenario. So we have time for Q&A now, so I'll open it up to you guys.
Any promising exoplanets for us to move to?
It's funny. We don't know of any yet. We are actually, NASA and the ESA are in the process of developing instruments that might actually allow us to analyze atmosphere on other planets. Right now, we can't really do that. We do know that it's looking more like super Earths probably have continents, which is good news, unless we want to modify ourselves to be aquatic animals. So within our own solar system, of course, there's places like Europa, despite what we were told in the movie 2010. All these worlds are yours except Europa. Europa is a moon of Jupiter that has an ocean beneath its icy crust. So there may be a possibility of life there, growing life there for us to eat, things like that. But then there's always the question of if we go to a planet and there's already life there, how ethical is it for us to go and insert ourselves into that ecosystem? So my feeling is probably in the end we'll end up living in synthetic structures that we build in space. The science fiction writer Iain M. Banks always said, a planet is a terrible use of matter, because you could always just take a planet apart and turn it into a giant halo world and there'd be a lot more surface area. Again, you'd only want to take apart a dead world. You don't want to wreck some exo-ecosystem. But so I think that's my sense of where we might be going if we're lucky. But so far, I think we're just going to have to stick with our solar system. So maybe Europa, next year in Europa.
Hi, I was curious, what are your thoughts on things like fracking and how it's affecting climate change versus what's going on with the natural progression of the Earth anyway?
I think fracking is a last-ditch effort to suck the last fossil fuels out of the planet. It's kind of like when you get to the bottom of the mayonnaise jar and you're like sticking your tongue in the bottom, like, ah! I don't know, probably none of you do that because mayonnaise is gross, but it's basically the equivalent of that. And I think it's testimony to how desperate we are for fuel and energy. And it's obviously a terrible long-term solution. And what we really need to be focusing on, and luckily what even our government here in the US is gently trying to focus on, especially the Department of Energy, are alternative fuels that are carbon neutral. So whether that's biofuels or, I'm a particular fan of solar fuel generators. There's a group at Berkeley that's partnered with a group at Caltech called the Center for Artificial Photosynthesis. And what they're trying to do is build a device that is it's ultimately kind of like a photovoltaic device, but it also uses water, and it produces a hydrocarbon liquid fuel that is from sunlight and water. And the idea would be, it's particularly seductive to me because you can work with the existing fuel infrastructure that we already have, which is designed around liquid fuel. One of the big problems with solar and wind energy, as you know, is storage. How do you store that energy? So if you could get liquid solar fuel, this hydrocarbon, that might be a really great way to transition into an alternative fuel source without having to change the infrastructure as much, because changing the energy infrastructure is a huge cost. And although, of course, building fracking facilities is also a huge cost. So it would really be nice to see people investing in alternative infrastructures too. So I guess the short answer is TLDR, fracking is a dead end. Alternative fuels are going to be the way to survive long term.
Hi, great to have you here. Thanks for coming out.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
You've touched briefly on the self-healing materials. And I was wondering if it's just the concepts and the competitions. I haven't done any research on that, but it's really interesting to me. And if there are already some materials that have been used, and how are the regulators and the government reacting to it? What do you hear? What do you read about it?
So yes, there are a few self-healing materials that are in use now. The self-healing polymer materials that I was mentioning before that are used in sealing ship hulls, for example, and other industrial uses. Those are biomimetic in the sense that they're trying to imitate a biological process, but they're not actually biological like the bacillophila that I mentioned to you. I am not aware of any product like bacillophila that's on the market. They're certainly in the pipeline at various research institutions. And self-healing materials generally are a huge focus of interest both for defense and for industry, because if you can have, for example, a self-healing material that when you shoot it with a bullet closes up again, and there actually is it's a transparent polymer that can do that. I saw it was like a Discovery Channel special where they showed it. Again, not in widespread deployment, but in the research stage. So it's a very big area of investment in materials science right now, and you'll find a lot of materials science labs that are focusing on that particular area. And like I said, it's sustainable as well as being a possible way of thinking about building materials as a part of the living environment instead of as something that's dead.
Some years ago in Scientific American, there was an article on one possible mass extinction mechanism of if we kill off enough of the aerobic life in the upper layers of our oceans, there's some perfectly happy anaerobic life down the lower layers that could come up and start farting us all to death with hydrogen sulfide. Have you heard any more updates on that theory?
Actually, there was a paper that came out just a few weeks ago about that, and it was actually looking at the Permian mass extinction, which I was explaining to you in such glowing terms. And one of the theories now is that a methane-producing microbe was adding to the greenhouse gas loading in the atmosphere at that time. So basically, what can happen is, as you probably know, if you get acidification in the oceans, oftentimes that can lead to algal blooms. And so if you get some of these toxic bugs that are producing things like methane gas, they might start thriving in the environment that we consider to be toxic, which is probably like revenge for Snowball Earth in some like broad sense. So yeah, I don't. No one knows for sure, but it is a theory, and it's certainly something that could happen. And as you probably remember, when we have big oil spills, for example, one of the outcomes can be bacteria eat a lot of the oil and produce these anoxic zones in the ocean. So bacteria can be involved in a lot of processes that create life for the bacteria, but then destroy habitats for other creatures in them. So yes, bacteria and other microbes are probably deeply involved in mass extinctions. And of course, now we know that the human body is host to so many biological organisms that keep us healthy too. So changing our environment can actually be killing off the microbes in our bodies that are keeping us alive. So basically, the future is studying the environment created by microbes and how that affects us. Most realistic movie or fiction about a disaster on Earth. I would have to say, I'll just pick on Kim Stanley Robinson because this is actually something that he writes about a lot. He has a novel that came out a couple of years ago called 2312, which I think is probably my favorite novel of his. I highly recommend it. It's set, not surprisingly, in the year 2312. And it's about a future where a lot of the geoengineering and biological engineering ideas I've been discussing today have actually come to pass. And there are radical bioengineering and environmental remediation groups who've come back to Earth from space, and their goal is to raise Florida out of the ocean again. because Florida has been completely submerged and, of course, displacing many people and many animals. So they're engaging in this, it's sort of a blending of environmentalism and geoengineering and slowly raising it up. They're also repopulating parts of the United States with wolves as well, which is really interesting. They're actually parachuting wolves in from their spaceships where they've been growing them in these space habitats. And it's actually quite a beautiful image, these wolves parachuting down into their new environment. And so I think the thing that I like about that is it is about this environmental disaster that we're facing now, but it imagines a future where environmentalism is deeply connected to geoengineering and bioengineering, that those two groups are no longer at odds, and they've figured out a way to use scientific interventions into the environment and into habitats to remediate the environment. So they're not viewing bioengineering as the enemy, but as a tool to fix the problems that we have on the planet. And that's very utopian. I think that would be a fantastic outcome. I don't know how likely it is, but it's certainly a very, very realistic picture of what climate change would be like, and then a hopeful picture of how we would fix it. So,
what's your opinion about technology singularity?
Technology and
Singularity.
I think that the future belongs to environments and ecosystems and biology. And I think we're far more likely to have a good future if we work on treating the planet like a computer. Instead of trying to turn the planet into a substrate for our brains to jack off forever to zombies and plants, which sounds really good in some ways, maybe what we might think about instead is that the planet itself is an incredibly complicated mechanism with many inputs and many outputs, and that our long-term goal could be to understand all of those and actually start intervening meaningfully so that we're actually kind of shepherding the entire environment of the planet and using our technology to maintain sustainable ecosystems and to maintain the planet at a temperature that we enjoy. We like it a little cool. We like those ice caps. As you may know, the ice caps are actually kind of an unusual thing for the planet to have. For most of the planet's history, there have been no ice caps. It's been warmer, more carbon in the environment. But if we can start to figure out how to control this amazing machine that we live on, maybe we can intervene and prevent those ice caps from going away and keep the ecosystems that we enjoy here. And then maybe we can go into space as well and bring our ecosystems along with us. And I think that's a much more hopeful view of life evolving. I feel like evolution and change really need to characterize our future, not uploading in a kind of static world.
Climate changing is coming toward us very fast. And what do you think that Google people, as a powerhouse of internet, have to do?
One of the things about Google is that it's already creating a sort of small utopian community, despite all of the pitfalls along the way. I think that as a company, Google is actually actively trying to invest in futuristic, sustainable technologies in a way that actually really surprises me all the time. There's a new, I read the other day that Google X now has to add a little pinch of science fiction to every project, which could be actually disastrous, but that's a good start. And I think to add to that, more specifically, I think that one of the things that Google has shown other companies is that there is a potential for learning a lot from massive amounts of data. And as I hinted earlier, what environmental science needs right now is massive data gathering and massive simulations based on that data so that we can start to understand the machine that's the planet. And so I think that Google provides a nice model for how that could be done. how you sell advertising to environmental simulation technology, I leave to the future to figure that out.
So you've talked a lot about like genetic engineering and genetic evolution that we can kind of use on ourselves to go towards the future. But what cultural and social evolutions do you see as also being, or possibly more necessary, in order for us to have a more positive outlook for our future?
That's a huge question. And one of the things that I consciously did in this book and in my research was focus on the science and the technology and the engineering questions, because many of those are close to being solved, which is great news for engineers and scientists, because yay, we've fixed everything. Now we just have to get implementation. How do we scale it, and how do we get people to adopt these radical ways of looking at the environment or at the future? I think the main things that we need to change really are how we plan for the future. I think that's one of the biggest issues that humans have to deal with, is thinking in terms of not just next year, but what's going to happen in a generation or 2 generations. And I think that's one of the big problems that people who talk about climate change deal with, because they're talking in these 100-year time spans. And ordinary people say, well, how can you tell from a computer simulation what's going to happen in 100 years? And it is very hard to answer that question. You know, to us, that might be like, well, duh, you know, of course, because we've put in all the inputs and we have a picture of what might happen, a statistically likely picture of what might happen. So, you know, there's many things that we can do, right? There's science education to get people thinking about this stuff. There's ways of getting people to think about changing how we treat the environment by thinking about things like food security and energy security instead of saving the animals, which I really want to save the animals, but that's a hard sell for people. But if you can say we're saving the future of food, or we're saving the future of energy, that allows groups like the Department of Energy, which is really investing heavily in alternative energies right now, that helps them frame the story in a more palatable way for people across the political spectrum. So I think it involves you know, reframing the questions a little bit. That's why I like to use the term survival, because I think that everyone understands the value of surviving and their lineage surviving. You know, I think hopefully our ideas are going to evolve alongside the technologies. And I just want to finish with a somewhat utopian thought here, which is that when you start getting frustrated about how people aren't changing quickly enough to fix things, consider the fact that we didn't even know that there was a carbon cycle 50 years ago. We really didn't. We didn't realize that what humans were doing, our industrial revolution was equivalent to a megavolcano going off in Siberia for 1,000 years. We just didn't know that. And 50 years later, environmental issues and alternative energy issues are at the top of many political leaders' lists of things they at least have to pay lip service to, if not actually engage in terms of policy and policy changes. So that's that's one generation. We went from totally clueless to actually starting to think about solving the problem. So humans actually do solve things over time. Like, we also screw things up. I realize that. There's like the whole Middle Ages issue. But at the same time, I think I have hope that we, in it perhaps even a shorter time span than we thought, may be able to solve some of these problems. Thanks very much.